for the living of these days, for the living of these days.
Well, tonight, Jonathan Huddleston is going to be preaching for us. Jonathan was one of the first professors I had when I entered graduate school at ACU, and he blessed me a lot in class, and I learned a lot from him. He has one son named Jacob, so we have a special connection there. I'm really excited for him to come preach for us tonight. I hope you guys are blessed as he comes to us. Jonathan, can I pray for you before you begin? Let's pray. God, we thank you for this time together. We thank you for this community that we have. And Lord, we pray tonight for Jonathan and for the words that he's going to speak to us. God, we pray that they're words from you, that he is your mouthpiece tonight, and that we'll be hearing directly from you as he preaches to us tonight. God, thank you so much for the things that you've done for us and for all the people in this room, for us coming together at this time. It's in Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Good evening. It's a privilege to be here, and I like to say that a lot. It's always a privilege to speak, but I think I mean that in different ways today. It's a privilege to be at Highland. It's a privilege to be at Abilene. I'm grateful for the way my journey and my story has brought me among people here, and I see a couple faces that I know from the Sunday school class. I see someone I got to teach in at ACU. It has been a strange but a wonderful journey for me. And I wanted to say that not only was it misleading if somebody thought that the Horizons class was over, it's also misleading that the relapse sermon on Judges is over, because I was so inspired by it and so inspired by Jake's sermon. They say that there are two responses to when you see a great work of art. We actually got to go to a museum when we were in North Carolina. They had several pieces of Monet. It was a traveling exhibit. They didn't just sit there, but it was gorgeous. And many people would just look at these paintings and kind of, I want to sit back. My son Jacob, he's now 13, so I don't know how old he was then, maybe 8 or 9 or 10. He had the perfect response though. He looked up at the painting and he said, I want to paint. I want to draw something. And so I hope that it's not an insult to Jake to say that last Wednesday, knowing that I'd be preaching this week, hearing him give his sermon, my mind, I want to say something. Not because I didn't like what you had to say on Ruth, but because I liked it so much. I want to say something about this theme of relapse, and especially this brilliant move. Is it your move, or did you get that from someone else, to turn to Ruth as the final sermon on Judges? Was that your own decision?
It was, I had read it.
You'd read it somewhere, okay. We'll credit the someone somewhere says as the author of Hebrews quotes scriptures that way. I always wonder why I couldn't get away with that in school. But someone somewhere says. See, this question of relapse, and I don't know how many of you were here for those 4 sermons of the series, and I don't know what all of the sermons said. I think I heard 2 of them. But it has actually intrigued me. I think it's probably the most important question, perhaps, in my spiritual life. How do we live change? How do we perceive change in our Christian life? I've gotten down, and by I've gotten down, I mean God beat it into me, that my salvation is based on the grace of God and not by anything I do. But I've also, that didn't change the fact that I recognize that what God is up to in the world is creating a holy people. God is not up to creating a bunch of people who run around sinning and just wait till heaven. And it has intrigued me, knowing that it's all about God and God's grace, knowing it's by the Spirit of God poured out on us that we are able to grow in the fruits of the Spirit. What do we do about the challenges to the grace and to the Spirit of God and to the work of God in our lives? Those places where love is not growing, where kindness is not growing, where joy is not growing, where peace is not growing. And what do we do about those places where we perceive in those around us in the church? Somebody was reminding me just this week that if you want to have a idealistic view of the church, don't be an elder, because you see how the sausage gets made. Don't get too close. If you don't join a small group, you join a small group two things happen. The first thing that happens is everybody starts getting closer and feeling like they like each other and opening up. The second thing that happens, because people start opening up, everybody starts seeing how absolutely more awful everybody around them is than they thought they were, and how annoying they are to themselves and to the people around them. There's a question for me, and it's a deep question. It's a question I think that's deeply written into Scripture. The prophets again and again come and call Israel back. And yet there's this question, really? Is it just going to be like this? That we'll sin and we'll turn back, and we'll sin and we'll turn back? Won't that ever change? And the prophets start speaking about maybe there needs to be a new heart or a new covenant. And yet, as recipients of the new covenant and as recipients of the new heart, many of us still question, is it still this cycle of unfaithfulness that's described in Judges? The people sinned, they cried out to the Lord, he sent a deliverer. The people sinned, they cried out to the Lord, he sent a deliverer. Hosea poses this question perhaps most starkly by saying, maybe it won't just be, oh, he gets drunk and smashes things, but then the next day he brings flowers and says, I'm sorry. Maybe a divorce is in the works here. I switched the genders because it's easier to see sometimes that way. That Israel has been like an unfaithful wife, or I would say like an abusive husband, if that image helps you any. That sometimes God needs to say, maybe a divorce is the right option here. And so Hosea poses this question most starkly. And even though Hosea, of course, ends in God's grace, there is a remarriage. There is a question. This remarriage better involve some change somehow, somewhere, some way. This can't just be the cycle of relapse over and over again. We can't live that. It's not sustainable. And yet, the question of how are we going to get out of that is, I think, extremely difficult. Extremely difficult. I was thinking about this when I was watching the Noah movie, which, by the way, I love the Noah movie, so you may have heard good or bad about it. You may not have even heard of it. But when I went to see it with some friends, part of why I love it, I noticed that movie experiences are fun for me based on who I'm with. And I was with some of the smartest, coolest people in Abilene, some grad students, a grad teacher, and we were just all flying with comments, and the parts of the movie that were silly we were enjoying, because hey, we were able to talk about how silly it was. So it's not that the movie, it was a story, right? And what intrigued me about the story is it pushed a little harder than we sometimes realize a theme that I think really is there in the Noah story, which is, what is God going to do about evil? What strategy is going to kind of work in dealing with evil? Is it to wipe people out? And if you start wiping people out, where do you stop? Should we have wiped everyone out? The movie presses that question. It's because Noah, the character in the movie, ends up deciding that all humans are supposed to die in the flood, which is kind of an intriguing thing for him to think, but not impossible. Because did you know in the Noah story, one of the first things that's said after they get off the ark, God puts the rainbow and says, I'm not going to flood the world again. Somebody telling the story didn't stop there. He added the phrase, even though people are still what they always were. Evil, the inclination is towards evil from the very beginning. In other words, the Noah story says, this solved nothing. Does that make sense? Flooding is not God's strategy for fixing the world. But what is? Judges has deliverers. And I think that these deliverers do some good. We hope they do some good. They were raised up by God. And yet, in some way, we'd have to say that a cycle of military deliverers is not God's strategy to make things better. Or if it was, it didn't work. The book of Judges goes downhill. And for the most part, these deliverers were jerks. I don't know if you read enough or heard enough in the sermons over this past month that I don't have to back that up. But for the most part, we have two assassins, right? One is someone who just goes to the king deceptively, straps the sword under his clothes so no one sees and stabs him. The other one is even funnier. People always like to talk about Deborah being the female judge in the book of Judges. Well, yes, she judged and prophesied in Israel. That's one verse. But in terms of the normal stories of a judge as a deliverer, the female judge in the book of Judges is not Deborah. The female judge in the book of Judges is Jael, who welcomes the enemy king into her tent, feeds him milk and honey, lets him fall asleep on her lap, and then takes a tent peg and drives it through his skull. It's an intriguing story, but I think that in some ways, by the way, maybe she's not a jerk, but I think that's not nice behavior. And I'm not blaming her, by the way. I'm saying she's just like all the others. Samson's the worst. He's the one who, sets fields on fire because he's mad about a girlfriend he lost. He's the one who kills a bunch of people in a rage because they don't want him carrying off their city gates. It's a strange story. And even in the end, he becomes sort of the world's first suicide bomber because his story ends with him killing himself in order to destroy a temple full of people. And yes, God is delivering. There's no question that God is delivering. But God is delivering through jerks who get things done. And this feels to me very like the world I know. That there are jerks who get things done. I talked to a fellow from Kenya. His name is Kip Alolia. And Kip was talking to me about, he is a Kenyan himself. And he was talking to me about the missionaries who came. And he said that there was a trend, especially more recently, where missionaries would come without quite this sort of arrogance, saying, because I'm American, I know everything. And they would listen better, and they would be kinder. But he said, and I thought this was funny, he said, sometimes we miss the old guy. He was such a jerk, but he got things done. And I've thought about that. I've thought about that when I've heard some people talking about Alexander Campbell. I don't know the guy well enough, okay? But I sometimes wonder if we're all here because some guy was a jerk enough to think that if he just said the right things, he was going to usher in the millennium, and that if everybody would just agree with him, then everything would be perfect. And I've talked to a friend of mine who's doing a biography of Alexander Campbell, who's saying this guy was actually kind of a jerk. You wouldn't want to be around him. I mean, what his idea of a fun time was to go out and debate people and tell them why they were wrong. And somehow we are heirs of people who, yes, got things done, maybe pushed the kingdom forward, and yet they did so in a way that was broken. For Alexander Campbell, it had to do with his ideas on race. He thought that he was going to win the whole world over by focusing on white people because they were the master race. And if we got enough white people into the church, then they could impose their will on the other races. And you read these writings and you go, there's a subtle problem to this, right? I always think it's funny when people talk about the good old days back before we had the immorality we have today. Like, racism isn't immorality. Slavery isn't immorality. You must have a very narrow version of immorality. And not to mention that there were probably the same sorts of sexual immoralities that the person's talking about, but there's many kinds of immorality. And I'm not saying we're better now. I'm saying we're messed up. And relapse is part of our story. And so we've been taught, maybe just people in my generation, but I don't think so. I think it's people of every generation. We've been taught to wonder, what is God up to? What's God going to do? And how's this going to be fixed? And we're very suspicious. There's a couple people there in this church. I think they're great. I think they're wonderful. But I cannot get my head around what they're saying. Their idea, and it's kind of like what's on our banners about Restore Abilene. Their idea is we're going to start this group, the 5 of us, and we're going to fix Abilene. We're going to diagnose all of the problems of Abilene. We're going to fix all of them. And I just look at these guys like, what are you talking about? What are you thinking? Some of this came to a head to me as I was questioning the question of what do we do with relapse? Where do we go from there? And then this last Sunday in our Sunday school, we were reading in Matthew 14. And oddly enough, someone in our Sunday school class who was kind of wondering, what is God up to? Where is my place? How do I make sure my life has meaning? Said he totally didn't understand this particular parable. I'm guessing most of the people in this room, it will just click with us, but I want to read it. Matthew 13:33, he told them another parable. The kingdom of heaven is like yeast that a woman took and mixed in with 3 measures of flour until all of it was leavened. That's it? Yeast, flour, leavened. Somehow, I think Jesus is suggesting that the small things, the unnoticed things, the little group of 20 or 30 people who meet on Wednesday nights, the wonderful godly guy who goes out and builds fences and takes broke people in to help him build fences and sings hymns while he builds, and I'm talking about my boss, John Isom. the lady who takes in a couple of foster kids, the small things, the very unnoticed things are spreading through the world like leaven. And that will somehow make the difference. And it's such a different vision than a flood, such a different vision than some guy who's going to get things done by burning fields and smacking people around with bones or swords or tent pegs. But in the end, it seems to be the direction that God has been moving all along. And I want to turn to the book of Ruth, which is where Jake went, and say, maybe this is God's answer to the book of Judges. And I want to just suggest three things real quick, because I've been talking so much of preamble that I don't have a lot of time left. There are three things going on in the book of Ruth that I think are worthy of our attention. The first one is the way Ruth joins the story. She joins a story that is larger than her own. I think that this is an overlooked component when we talk about God loving outsiders and the joy we have of not focusing inward but wanting to care about outsiders. There's nothing wrong with focusing on outsiders. I think that's a great focus. But in Scripture, if we see Ezra and Nehemiah as these kind of mean guys, and maybe you don't know, read the books. It's somewhat troubling. These mean guys who won't let the foreign women come in, and Ruth is the answer, says, you should let the foreign women come in. You should let those Moabites come in. I want you to notice that Ruth is a lot more like Ezra and Nehemiah than we might think. The book of Ruth does not say that this Moabite woman just gets to come in and be a Moabite woman and keep her story and make that primary, and somehow that works well in Israel. Instead, she says this wonderful verse, which has been somewhat misused, I think, by weddings. Your people will be my people. Your God will be my God. That's not a wedding verse. That's a baptism verse. That is a join the family, join the story verse. Ruth is saying, I'm not part of the Moabite story anymore. I'm part of the Israelite story. And I think one way that we move beyond relapse is to join a different story. And the fact is that doesn't solve everything. We can't just say, I focus on God, I believe in Jesus, now I'm not going to relapse. But somehow it changes everything. Doesn't solve everything, but it changes everything. One thing I've noticed, I've been part of a 12-step group at parts of my life. No, you don't get to hear what the addiction is. But there's the part of the 12-step group where it talks about we believe that a higher power is kind of at work and is going to bring us out of this craziness. And what's funny is that when you say those words and you come to that belief, you look at your very relapses differently. The very times I may lie, the very times I may sin, I'm now saying, what does this mean in the story in which God is at work in me? Maybe it means that my life is learning humility and learning how to repent and learning my own weakness. That's a very different place than that hopeless place that says, I'm not moving anywhere, I'm not going anywhere. Does that make sense? A drunk person in Alcoholics Anonymous can actually go out and get drunk again and say, this was part of my recovery. Does that make sense? Not that I wanted to get drunk again, not that that's what anybody hoped for that person, but that's a step. Because I got drunk and I woke up the next morning and I called my sponsor and I learned how to move on. Because I'm part of a new story where a higher power is taking me somewhere different than I would go myself. And I want to suggest that Ruth, when she says, I'm going to join your family, I'm going to join your story, is not just showing loyalty to Naomi. She's becoming a different person. And that person that she's becoming is going to take her places that she can't guess. She doesn't know where that's going to take her. But she is willing to start that journey. The second thing I'm going to say is family care. The book of Ruth is about families taking care of one another. Family taking care of one another. Ruth taking care of Naomi. Naomi taking care of Ruth. Boaz taking care of Ruth, but also Ruth taking care of Boaz. One of the beautiful things about Boaz's response to Ruth is that he does not say, oh, well, I'll take care of you because I'm so great. He says, wow, you've done a great thing by turning to family. And now I will do the right thing by being family to you. And there's a word, it's impossible to translate into English. Some will translate it redeemer, and it means family who takes care of you and who comes in when you need trouble. But it's a family word, but we translate it redeemer. I think some of the old translation call it kinsman redeemer, which is a funny word, but kind of two words stuck together. But it's family taking care of you, almost the way my uncle bought a gas station. This is just to remind me that all these problems with people being unemployed or broke or out of jobs is not just my problem, not just my generation, not just this recession. It's happened before. My uncle bought a gas station. He worked it. There was fine print he didn't know where he had to pay a price for gas that was above the market value, and he was in deep debt. And so his parents, my grandparents, bailed him out, because that's what happens when you get in trouble, is your family bails you out. And they sent him to a trade school, and he started working on being an engineer, and he was so great on it, he's now retired from NASA. And I look at him, and here's this rich, smart, successful guy, but without a redeemer, without family bailing him out, none of that would have happened. And I think most of us can really say, you know, the changes in our lives didn't come because of a soup kitchen, and the changes in our lives didn't come because of Bill Gates. The changes in our lives came because family bailed us out. And there's a really funny point in Ruth where Boaz has met Ruth, and he said kind of a nice sounding blessing. I think he's a good guy. He's a great guy. She's gleaning in his fields, and he's given her way more than he needs to. He's just a very good guy. But maybe this sounds a little bit like a pious platitude. Boaz tells Ruth, hey, may God spread his wing over you. Kind of a joke here that only Ruth gets. The word wing in Hebrew is also the word for the flap of your robe. And you spread that over your wife or your kid or someone you're taking into your family. And so when Boaz says, may God spread his wing over you, next chapter, Ruth comes to Boaz's feet at night and says, Boaz, spread your wing over me. Put your money where your mouth is. And Boaz does. That somehow the Redeemer, who is God, and the Redeemer, who is a family guy helping you out, is the same person. Now, I'm not trying to say this is just about family. Certainly not just biological family. One of the great things about the church is that the church becomes now a family. It doesn't become a charity. Paul says, oh, do good for everyone, but especially of the household of believers. There's still a sense where the greatest work is done. And this is not a knock on all people's attempts to do so many other things. The greatest work is done, in my experience, though, by people who have started to become family. The tragedy is that our concept of charity is probably that we go to strangers and we give them some things, instead of we find people who need family and we start being family to them. The third thing that I see in Ruth that I think is an answer to relapse. Because if you've had any struggle that you're relapsing, I think joining God's story and a family care, someone who reaches in to bail you out when you need it, are you will say that is what kept me alive, and that is what kept me going. The third thing is a strange thing that the Old Testament has taught me, but it helps me take a perspective, and I'm sure some of you who are older than I am may resonate with this more than I do. A perspective for the future, a really long-term perspective that says what my life accomplishes and where I am in my addiction and how good I am as a Christian is not about today, and it's not about this week, and it's not about this month, and it may not even be about this year. It's a long story, and it might be more about what's going to be the outcome for my grandkids. Because the cycle of unfaithfulness is generational. Alcoholics have kids who become alcoholics. Abusers have kids who become abusers. Liars have kids who become liars. Hypocritical jerks have kids who become hypocritical jerks. And we're so frustrated sometimes that we can't break it overnight, that we can't change in a moment. But sometimes I wonder if we're just passing on something a little different to our kids, and they're passing on something a little different to their kids. And if we are spreading and working like that leaven that Jesus talked about through the dough, or like the mustard seed, that seed imagery is an important one in the Old Testament, because so often Israel is told, you're a seed, you're just going to sit in the ground, and eventually the seed will grow. You don't know when, you don't know where. And I get this, of course, from the ending of Ruth. The ending of Ruth is kind of funny. There's this whole deal with the kinsman redeemer, and I actually think that this has been misunderstood. I can't. There's a fascinating thing where the Hebrew is mixed up, and you can't even tell what Boaz is saying, or whether he's saying that the other guy ought to marry her, or he's saying, no, I'm going to marry her. But the great part comes when that's all cleared away, and you get rid of the other guy, and Boaz himself is going to marry Ruth, which everybody knows is how a good love comedy ends, right? But the women give their blessing, and they say, this woman is going to be like Leah and Rachel and Tamar. Like who? Leah and Rachel, these sisters who had such a struggle. Such a struggle. Jacob, remember, wanted to marry Rachel and got a switcheroo, and then he had to marry two sisters, and he loved one and not the other, and Rachel felt frustrated because she couldn't have kids, and Leah was having all the kids, and Leah felt frustrated because her little sister was prettier than she was, and Jacob felt frustrated because he was slaving away for 14 years, and everybody was frustrated. And what came of their frustration? The 12 tribes of Israel. Every single name was about, oh, maybe God will hear me, or oh, I struggle, or oh, I call out to God. And those names become the names of the tribes of Israel. Or Tamar. Tamar, what a strange story. I think we have some biblically literate people here, so I won't go into it all. But Tamar is the woman, remember, who didn't get the husband she was supposed to get, so she dressed up like a prostitute and slept with her father-in-law, right? Wasn't that kind of a strange story? Why would you say, blessing, may you be like Tamar? Because Tamar was the person who did something strange for the future. And that, by the way, sheds a little different light on the book of Matthew, where it gives Jesus' genealogy, and it mentions Tamar, and it mentions Bathsheba, and it mentions Rahab the prostitute, right? I've heard lots of sermons on this that mention how, Jonathan's preached one, how these are scandalous women. These were all women involved in sex scandals. And that's true. That's true. But I wonder if we've taken the wrong thing from their story. These were women who took action for the future. Rahab says, I'm going to put red on my door, and our family will survive into the future. And she joined a new story. Ruth says, may your people will be my people, and your God will be my God. She goes to the threshing floor because she is creating a future for herself and for her mother-in-law. Bathsheba. We actually don't know much about what's going on with Bathsheba during the early part of the story, right? David sees her, he takes her. Did she even have a say? Let's go later when she actually is doing stuff. What is she doing? Does anyone know? She has been promised that her child Solomon will become king. He's the one that God has chosen. He's the one David has chosen. But some other guy, not her son, is starting to be king. She whips up, gets a prophet, gets a donkey, whips up a parade, and gets the right person to be king. These are people and Tamar, strange what she did, but the one thing we know she did was she got children and grandchildren for Judah when he otherwise wouldn't have had them. And that became the line of David, that became the line of Jesus. These are people taking action for the future. And I wonder if part of the answer to relapse is to realize, now that we've joined a story, and now that we've seen that God works in the world through family care, we can also see that that the future is more important than we thought it was. And notice the future here isn't about let's just do nothing and die and go to heaven. The future here is about building things that are very tenuous. They're like leaven in bread. But they make a difference. They become great multitudes and no one really knows when or how or why. Because a child was born. Because women joined the family of covenant, because faithful people taught the stories. And faithful people listened to what was taught and passed it on. In other words, I want to suggest that we are doing God's plan right now, right here, to change the world. He decided instead of floods and instead of jerks who get things done, he's going to take broken people slogging their way through, propping each other up, and making things just a little bit better than they were the day before, over and over and over and over again. Jake was in my class, my prophets class, and I assigned them this prophets class, an assignment. See, I couldn't figure out what to do to apply the message of the prophets, so I said they had to figure out what to do to apply the message of the prophets. And I actually thought that somebody was going to start an orphanage, and somebody else was going to start some huge program, and that we were it was just going to change the world. And what we did was so small. Do you remember what we did? We worked on a garden, on a community garden. We worked on wearing the same clothes for a week. That was about understanding how people are oppressed by our cheap clothes. It was kind of a strange thing. Do you know most of us are wearing cheap clothes because of really, really bad factories in Indonesia and other places? It's kind of strange. But anyway, we worked on that. We worked on listening to the stories of people who've been misplaced. We worked on building a house, but we didn't build a house. Well, we paint a part of a porch. We did such small things. And yet, what I can say about each of those steps is we leaned on each other as broken people, and the next day it was a little better. That sort of thing is the mustard seed. That's the leaven in the bread. We are God's plan to change the world because we are the family in which God himself has said, I am your kinsman redeemer. I'm going to come, I'm going to act, and I'm going to bring 1,000 different people. I heard a story once. It was mistold. The story was that Jesus is headed up to heaven after the resurrection and ascension, and an angel grabs him and says, Jesus, there's only a few hundred people down there who really believed in you and decided to follow you. If they don't spread this to the rest of the world, if they fail, what's your plan B? And the way I heard the story told, Jesus says, they won't fail. There is no plan B. And it was kind of like, ta-da, we won't fail, we're the church. I think the story was mistold. I think what Jesus probably would really have said to that angel is, what do you mean if they fail? They've already failed and they're going to fail again. It's still going to continue. Failing forward, leaning on each other, calling on God, receiving every once in a while that little nudge that, or sometimes if you're Peter, not a little nudge, a smack in the head. Come on, Peter, he's a Gentile, so what? Get over it. But whatever it is, they'll fail and they will push forward because they're part of a story. They're working for the future. They're a new family, the family of God. Thanks for being with us. Do we have another song?